Hello, my name is Adele Tromlin, and for the fourth episode of the Dakini Conversations podcast, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Geoffrey Barstow, one of the leading scholars and writers in the world today on the topic of vegetarianism and eating animals in Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. Dr. Barstow has spent significant time studying the Tibetan language and Buddhist philosophy in Nepal and Tibet. His PhD is from the University of Virginia, entitled Food of Sinful Demons, Meat, Vegetarianism, and the Limits of Buddhism in Tibet. It was later published as a book, and he is currently an associate professor at Oregon State University. His work looks to the lives and examples of great Tibetan Buddhist masters, such as the eighth Karmapa, Kunkyen Dopapa, Jigme Lingpa, Shabka, and more recent masters such as Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro Rinpoche and Jadrel Rinpoche, and their writings an example of vegetarianism in Tibet, both prior to and after 1959. His most recent book, The Faults of Meat, Tibetan Buddhist Writings on Vegetarianism, is an edited compilation of new and original translations by such masters on eating animals and Buddhism. Dr. Barstow also considers the recent surge in vegetarianism in Tibet as identity resistance to cultural hegemony, as well as to Buddhist ideas. Therefore, it is with great pleasure to welcome Dr. Barstow. A good evening here from India, and good morning to you, Dr. Barstow, in the US.
Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. It's quite a treat. I appreciate it.
So first of all, I would like to speak to you briefly about your life. So could you tell me a little bit about where you were born and where you grew up?
Where I was born? Well, back in the day, right? I was born in Connecticut and moved to Texas when I was 10, moved around a lot at that point. I'm thinking it's always sort of interesting to think about our backgrounds on these things and how we sort of come into what we end up studying. And for me, a lot of it is a blend of, the personal that then sort of, transferred over to the professional. And really, by the time I was in high school, I was very much, I was one of these searchers, right? Out reading all the stuff I could get my hands on in terms of particularly non-Western religious traditions, although, also some of, Wicca and some pagan stuff from Europe. Really was just kind of exploring and absorbing and found it all kind of fun. And by the time I got to college, that was really sort of where my interests were. And I was very fortunate to be able to really pursue what I was interested in, right? And so I went to a school called Hampshire College, where you get to really kind of design your own curriculum. And you sit down early on in your time there with some faculty. And, I'm still good friends with some of the faculty that were on my committee at that point, Sue Darlington, Alan Hodder. And I said, I want to study Buddhism. And they said, okay, well, what are we going to do? And we pulled stuff together. And part of that then also was a study abroad in January of '99. And so I went to India with this sort of Hampshire College sponsored program, studied at what was then called the Central Institute for Higher Tibetan Studies in Sarnath. So I was there for a month. And that was really my first exposure to really to Buddhism outside of books, and definitely to Tibetan culture. And so that was really, it's funny. It ends up being this event that is with these things that you don't really notice at the time, but it ends up being really transformative. And so after that in college, that was like, okay, this is what I want to study. I want to study Tibetan culture, Buddhism, all that jazz. And so the rest of my college career was basically focused on that. And I took, whatever classes I could take, whatever was available to me.
Okay, can I just ask you though? So when you decided that you wanted to study Buddhism, what was the reason for that? I mean, your background, where are you from in America?
I was born in Connecticut, raised in Texas.
Right.
And no, I mean, this was personal. It was very much a personal interest in these things. It was very much me trying to figure out what I thought was right in the world and sort of how to approach things. It was never purely academic, right? As if, I don't think it's purely academic for most of us, right? We study the things that we're interested in, and we're interested in them for all kinds of reasons. But for me personally, it was very much a personal thing, right? And I was very fortunate to be able to do that through in college as well.
So are your family Buddhist, or do you come from a Buddhist background?
No, not at all. I have no, they are all, fairly, wonderful people. But yeah, no Buddhism in there at all. It was not something I was raised with. It was not something I was familiar with at all. Really prior to college. But then in college, I was able to really, jump in with both feet, and ended up doing the Antioch program in Bodh Gaya in 2000. And, I actually got to spend some time in China and Tibet before that. And so the Antioch program then is when I connected with Jigten Rinpoche and learned about the Rinpoche Yeshe Institute. And so, it was one of those things where it's like, once I learned about it, I immediately was like, oh, yes, this is what I want to do. And went back to the US, finished college, but then, worked for a while, saved some money, and immediately came back to Kathmandu and spent 4 years studying at Rinpoche Yeshe. And that was really like, those are the formative times for a lot of us. And that was really where I really sort of cut my teeth in Buddhist studies on both a personal and a professional level.
Yes, well, you studied at Kathmandu University, right, as well, which is affiliated with Rinpoche Yeshe Institute. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your time in Kathmandu there. I mean, were there any particularly formative experiences or teachers? I mean, you mentioned Jigten Rinpoche. Any other teachers that you really connected with while you were there?
I think there were a lot of really amazing teachers that I got to meet. There were fewer that I really got to know and really work with on a sort of close, ongoing basis. And to my mind, that's fine, right? That shouldn't sound like a regret, right? I feel extremely fortunate to continue to study with Jigten Rinpoche. He's, especially at that point, clearly my primary teacher. Yes. But there were quite a number of other masters, that I met. I think of Trungpa Rinpoche, who recently passed. Pakchok Rinpoche, Choling Rinpoche, and Pakchok Rinpoche, Choling Rinpoche were probably the other teachers that I was closest to, but they were also very much in that mandala around Rinpoche.
So you studied Tibetan, and did you also study Sanskrit while you were at the Rinpoche Yeshe Institute? And how important do you think it is for a scholar and a translator to have a good level of, for example, the colloquial language in Tibetan?
Yeah. I mean, I think having a good grasp of colloquial is really important, and I don't think these days I don't think that's a too controversial statement. I think most of us agree that it's important to have that. Aside from linguistics, it's important to have, I think, especially if you're going to be translating stuff that's not strict philosophy, it's important to have at least some grasp of cultural norms. And, it's like so many times you're translating something and and you're looking at it, and you're like, this doesn't make sense, or at least it wouldn't make sense if you didn't have like already an awareness of a particular kind of practice or what things look like, or something like that. And so I think it's important as a translator, clearly, to have some familiarity, and ideally on the ground familiarity with with Tibetan language and Tibetan cultures. I never studied Sanskrit, and I've never regretted the decision not to study Sanskrit. That's me personally. I've sometimes felt like, people come at sort of, it's like Tibetan +1, and people are either Tibetan plus Sanskrit or Tibetan plus Chinese. And so I did Chinese. And so that's been actually super useful for me. I don't translate from the Chinese, it's not that good. But having the ability to move around and communicate and do interviews in Chinese has been very useful for me.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we'll get onto that when we talk about your going into Tibet to do your research. Now, if you're moving on to your academic studies then, so you did a PhD at the University of Virginia in 2013, correct? And your PhD was provocatively titled, for some anyway, Food of Sinful Demons, A Religious History of Vegetarianism in Tibet. First of all, I'd like to just ask you a little bit about that PhD. Why did you choose that topic? Who supervised it? And also, why did you choose the title Food of Sinful Demons for it?
Yeah. So, okay. When I feel like a lot of your listeners may be in the academic world, so they may know this already, but it's like picking your PhD topic is this like major transitional moment, right? It's like, it's almost like this is the choice that kind of defines your whole career going forward. And you want to get a good one, right? You want to get something that is good for you, that's good for the community and things like that. I started out at Virginia not with a very strong sense of direction. And I was initially I spent about 1.5 years working on a project focused on the Mani Kabum and early ideas of kingship in Tibet, and the role of Avalokiteshvara in sort of the development of that and this whole narrative. And I wasn't super into it from my side. It was sort of like, oh, I need something here. Okay, I'll work on this. And I also, the more I got into it, the more I felt like all I was going to do was upset my Tibetan friends. And so then, I wasn't super enamored of it. And at some point I was reading the Words of My Perfect Teacher, Jadrel Rinpoche, just for my own sake, right? It wasn't part of it wasn't an academic thing at that point. I was just like, oh, I haven't read this in a while. Let me read this again. And there's a few passages in there where Patrul is critical of meat eating. And I was personally vegetarian at that point, had been for a while. And I was sort of, but also I'd spent a lot of time with Tibetans, and most of them were eating meat without reservation. And I was kind of like, oh, this is interesting. And so that just sort of coming across those passages in Where's My Perfect Teacher really kind of prompted me to look a little bit, found a couple of other similar passages in other texts, and all of a sudden I was like, okay, there's something here, let me look at this. I went to my advisor, it was Curtis Schaefer. I worked with Curtis Schaefer and David Germano. And I was actually very nervous about that conversation because I was going to ask to change my dissertation topic from this one that I'd already invested a bunch of time into, and to this new topic on the question of vegetarianism. And I remember very clearly going into Curtis's office and saying, I want to do this instead, and waiting and kind of expecting him to say, no, you've already put in all that other time. And he just thought about it for a second and said, yep, change, do it. And I've been really grateful ever since for his willingness and for that piece of advice, and for his willingness to work with me as I sort of transition from one topic to another. And I also feel really fortunate. It's fortune or luck is a thing in here, right? Like, I just happened to come across this passage in Words of My Perfect Teacher that prompted this whole thing, right? I could have easily never thought about it at all. But it struck me as just sort of like a wonderful topic. It hadn't been studied academically before. It was something that I kind of cared about personally. And the more I got into it, I also realized it was a live issue in Tibetan communities. And that it felt like it was something that I could study and work on that would be part of a dialogue, right? Part of a conversation, not purely extractive, right? Not just coming in and saying, let me, learn this thing from you guys, but let me come and have a conversation here. And maybe there's things that I can do that will actually contribute to that conversation or be useful to my Tibetan friends. And so that was, all of these were kind of the thoughts going around about this. And the big question at the outset was, okay, that's all great, but is there going to be enough material, right? Like, will there be enough for me to write a dissertation and then a book on this? And kind of surprisingly, there really was, right? That it didn't take too long in the sort of the research process to start to realize that actually, this question of vegetarianism is not just a contemporary question in Tibet. It's actually been a question for 1,000 years. And there are people on both sides of that debate who had very strong convictions about whether people should or should not eat meat.
Well, exactly. We're going to get onto that as well a bit later. But as for the title then, Food of Simple Demons, was there a particular inspiration for that? Did you take it from a text?
I did. It's from Nyammey Sherab Gyeltsen, Bone Master. And I picked it because it catches, it sort of grabs you.
Of course, it's very provocative.
People would see it, people would see it on a bookshelf and be like, what is this? And it's a little provocative. It is a direct quote from Nyammey Sherab Gyeltsen.
Right. Okay. Well, that's interesting to know. And obviously, like you say, some people really believe that it is Food of Simple Demons, not just in Tibetan Buddhism, but in other religious traditions and non-secular people, especially these days, which we'll get onto now. Now, you mentioned you are vegetarian or were vegetarian when you started your PhD. So before we get onto vegetarianism in Tibet and within Tibetan Buddhism, so why did you become a vegetarian or a vegan? What was the main reason for that?
Initially, it was because I was in high school and trying to impress a girl.
Oh, okay.
I had started dating someone who was vegetarian, and as one does, and the relationship didn't last very long. But I stayed vegetarian at that point for a few years. Really until I was going to China for the first time, and all my friends said, "Oh, you can't be vegetarian in China. You can't do it. It won't work. You'll have to eat meat." And so which is totally not true. It's actually extremely easy to be vegetarian in China. So if anyone listening to this is wondering about like, oh, can I? It's so easy in China. It's so much easier than places. But I didn't know that. I'd never been, and everyone was telling me the opposite. And so I did start eating meat again before going to China. And then, as happens sometimes, continued for a couple of years into, a year probably into my time in Kathmandu. It was just something that I was struggling with, and I'd come to this place of, kind of thinking I wanted to be vegetarian again. Eventually then made the choice to be vegetarian. about a year, maybe a year and a half after that, I had the fortunate opportunity to go and take vegetarian vows from Jadrel Rinpoche.
Oh,
And
great.
so,
Wow. Yeah.
yeah, I was able to see him at his place in Siliguri. Yeah, that was probably, I want to say 2006, maybe 2007.
Yes.
Yeah, and I've been vegetarian since then. I'm not, I haven't been vegan. It sort of comes and goes. I kind of wish I was, but it's it's sometimes proved difficult for me
Yes.
to keep that.
Yes, it's not as easy to be vegan. It's true
It's
in
not,
many places. But you mentioned Jadrel Rinpoche, and of course he is a very well-known vegetarian advocate, particularly in the 20th century. So we can discuss him a bit later. But in terms of if we just stick with what Buddha taught about eating animals, let's say eating murdered animals in particular. I thought we could just talk a little bit about that before going on to the Tibetan Buddhist. How much, for example, when you were studying Buddhism, how much did that play a part in your wanting to be vegetarian again? For example, as you know, the Buddha gave many teachings in the sutras on the importance of not eating slaughtered animals, not just to monastics, but also to lay people, right?
Yeah, I have to say, honestly, when I was on a personal level, when I was thinking about it when I was living in Kathmandu and such like that, I wasn't paying attention to textual sources.
Okay.
Like I wasn't reading, I probably hadn't even heard of like the Lankavatara Sutra or the Mahayana Sutra, or certainly hadn't paid any attention to Vinaya questions about eating meat. It really was much more just a general sense of from my personal side of feeling kind of like I'm not really comfortable with this, with what I'm doing with this. It wasn't at that point, at least it wasn't well sourced textually, right? There certainly, and there weren't a lot of, I knew about Jadrel Rinpoche, of course. But I had not met a lot of other Tibetan vegetarians at the time. Well, we can talk about this later, but my feeling from what I've seen and who I've talked to is that the vegetarian movement among Tibetans really took off later, right? And in the early 2000s, it really wasn't that strong, at least not as strong as it became a decade after that. So it really was more a question of just sort of personal feelings and chatting with friends, right? I wasn't the only person in the Rangjung Yeshe community thinking about vegetarianism. And so, we would sit around and, I feel like we'd sit around and double dorje and eat momos and, be like, Amala, the woman who used to run double dorje, be like, what else can you put in these other than meat? Like, what can we do with this? And have those conversations. And it was just sort of a general thing. It wasn't a research topic.
Yes, well, exactly. I mean, and for most people, I think, a lot of people, when they come into being a vegetarian, it's predominantly motivated by compassion, right? Or caring for animals or the welfare of animals or the environment, particularly now, which we can, again, get onto a little bit later. But what about influences outside of Buddhism then? So, of course, animal welfare and compassion, but was there any sort of non-Buddhist sort of influences, for example, like environmentalism, or, someone like Peter Singer, who's very well known for his work on animal rights and animal welfare?
Well, we'd have to credit that early romantic interest in high school for some influence. She was, to the best of my knowledge, not influenced by Buddhism at all. I wasn't aware of Buddhism at the time. but no formal influence. Like I wasn't familiar with Peter Singer until much later. I had not been, I was sort of probably vaguely aware of the environmental benefits of avoiding meat, but not in any kind of complex way. I mean,
right. So
yeah.
what was the defining thing then? Was it compassion for the animals or animal welfare?
It was sitting here and just sort of wrestling with, and again, not by myself, right? Not like just like me sitting here alone. We were talking about this. This was a topic of conversation,
right,
amongst lots of us, and sitting there and feeling like, like, yeah, we're talking about compassion, and here we are eating slaughtered animals. Like, how do we make sense of this? And and then at the same time, this feeling of like, we really like doing this, and so there's a tension here, and it really wasn't a super heavily like theorized kind of thing, more just a general sense of there's an awkwardness here, and maybe we should be trying to,
consider the animals.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot of people, they start to put animal welfare in as a sort of priority, right? That's kind of one of a big defining factor of why a lot of people become vegetarians, and not just what other people think, but also, what the effect it's having on the animals, or, sort of slaughtering animals and the cruelty and suffering that's involved in that. But anyway, let's move on to sort of, the idea of eating slaughtered animals in Tibetan Buddhist sort of thought then, because obviously that is where you've done most of your research. And also, we can also then talk a little bit also about maybe some of what the Buddha taught and how that has impacted Tibetan Buddhism or not, as the case may be. Is there a disconnect there, let's say, between what the Buddha taught and what some Tibetan Buddhists anyway are actually doing, practically what they're eating on a daily basis? So in your book, or one of your books, you also have compiled a selection of writings on vegetarianism called The Faults of Meat, which was published recently. And you say in a Tricycle article about this as well, that you found 110 teachers who are quite well known in Tibet who were or became vegetarians, and you've edited some of the texts that they wrote on meat eating, and put them together, the translations. So I thought we could talk a little bit about that, because obviously, actions speak louder than words, as we say, and the fact that there are these teachers and these great Tibetan Buddhist masters within most of the main Tibetan Buddhist lineages who were vegetarians or wrote about vegetarianism is obviously quite compelling. So perhaps we could, take a look at some of the main people that you've considered in your work, sort of lineage by lineage, perhaps. So, if we were to start with the Kagyu, for example, who would you say was, one of the main leading figures in the Kagyu on sort of vegetarianism?
I mean, I think it's it's an interesting question. And in some ways, I think I don't actually know if lineage by lineage is the best way to think about it, especially for the early period, because I think there was a lot more fluidity between lineages than we think of. And so when I think about like early period stuff, I didn't find a lot from like first dissemination sources, like historical sources, like reliably datable kind of stuff. There's also just not a lot there. There's one intriguing reference in the Bashe, but it doesn't necessarily point to sort of ethical vegetarianism either. That's a whole nother kind of question. But definitely by the time we get to the early second dissemination, figures like Atisha and Dronton discussing it, at least. It's hard also to always know when the discussion translates into identity, kind of, or like this is what someone does. So there's a lot that it feels it's difficult to claim with certainty, especially in the early sources. But clearly, by the time we get to Kathmandu and his disciples, yeah, they are very clearly and very vocally vegetarian, right? They're not just, it's not just a little quiet thing in the side. It's like this is a thing that they're talking about. They're saying you should be, you know, several. So Taklang Tangpa, the Taklang Kagyu, Jigten Sumgon, lots of these figures that later on they're you know, oh, this is the head of this particular lineage of the Kagyu, right? I mean, these people were vegetarian, and they were quite vocal about it.
For example, recently the 17th Karmapa Gyaltsen Lodro Je has been giving a lot of teachings on the Karma Kagyu and vegetarianism, and he also now is a strict vegetarian, and he very much seems to take the view that it's not allowed or permitted in the Buddhist teachings, except in very limited circumstances. So, for example, he taught about the threefold purity rule that, you know, Buddha created for the monastic sangha when they would go begging for food. And so the 17th Karmapa taught about this, and how, as a result of this kind of teaching, that you know, the Karmapas in particular, like the 7th and the 8th Karmapas, and himself included, were strict vegetarians, and wrote about this quite significantly. So perhaps you could also talk about that, because the 8th Karmapa is mentioned in your book. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, several of the sort of the members of the Karmapa lineage were vegetarian, and you know, fairly strictly as far as we can tell from the sources. You know, the sort of the transmission of vegetarianism as a practice, as far as I can tell, is not always like, you know, one to one, but it's something that kind of it comes and goes and waxed and waned in popularity. But yeah, I mean, particularly within, you know, the Kagyu, if we, you know, step outside of the Karma Kagyu, early leaders of the Taklang Kagyu, Jigten Sumgon, Taklang Tangpa, several of the people in sort of Pakmadrupa's sort of early milieu seem to have been pretty strictly vegetarian, and that, you know, has continued on, you know, on and off, waxing and waning. But there's an important sort of element of continuity there as well. And, you know, in some ways, I think we see this most clearly in the Karmapa lineage, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and perhaps you could also mention some of the other sort of well-known names in your book. For The Faults of Meat, for example, you also have written quite a bit about Jigme Lingpa, and Shabka Tsogjo Randrol, for example, and also the Jonan Kunkien Dolpopa. So these are also examples of Tibetan Buddhist masters prior to the Chinese communist invasion of Tibet, who were all very much following the Buddha's teachings, let's say, on you know, slaughtered animals not being permissible, even within sort of Vajrayana settings, for example. So there's a kind of sometimes a common misperception, right, that you know, for the tzok and things like that, it's absolutely necessary to eat meat, whereas some of these people were saying, no, it's not even necessary then. And for example, Jadrel Rinpoche was also saying that, right?
Yeah, so let's let me start maybe with some of the history of, you know, some of these people that you mentioned. You know, when we're thinking about sort of the history of vegetarianism in Tibet, I often feel like it's sometimes it's sort of easier to think of it in terms of time periods rather than like lineages per se. And so there was a movement really in what I probably like the 12th up until the 15th, 16th century, where it really seems like there was a lot of vegetarianism being practiced, a lot of it being talked about. Obviously, it's hard to reconstruct now what was going on then, particularly if we step away from the elite people. Like we have these Namtra, these biographies of Dolpopa and Ngorchen Kokazangpo and these really important masters and what they had to say. We have a much harder time interpreting what was going on around them among people who didn't get biographies written. But clearly there's, in that time window, that sort of 12th to 15th, 16th century, there are a lot of people from all of the lineages who were actively practicing vegetarianism. In addition to these Buddhist lineages that you're talking about, it's really important to remember that Bon was active in here and that there were Bon teachers who were promoting vegetarianism. I mentioned Nyammey Sherab Gyeltsen before, and the title of my book, right? I mean, he's a Bon figure. So all through this period, there was this sort of consistent, I think I refer to it often as like a consistent minority. My assumption tends to be it was a minority, but nonetheless, it's pretty consistent and it's pretty vocal. And there are some places, and we might think of Ngor, the Ngorpa Sakya monastery of Ngor, and its founder, Ngorchen Kokazangpo, as a place where really like vegetarianism may well have been the norm for a couple of centuries within this monastery.
Yeah.
And so there really was this, this movement. And then, at some point, it sort of wanes a little bit, and there's maybe a little bit less. And then it picks up again with some later figures. And you mentioned Jigme Lingpa, and in my reading of this, Jigme Lingpa is actually kind of a linchpin, even though I'm not actually certain that he himself was personally vegetarian. But the things that he writes about meat eating get picked up by people in his immediate lineage. You mentioned Shabkar, also Dokchen was really important in there. And that gets picked up in Kham in the 19th century, in the time what they call the Ri-mey, the non-sectarian movement. And you really get this like flourishing of vegetarianism in late 19th and early 20th century Kham. And I've had the good fortune to be able to interview some elderly monks and lamas who remember the pre-communist period, and have just asked them, like, when you were little at your monastery, were there a lot of vegetarians? And a lot of them have said, yeah, there really were, right? There were a lot of people at that time who were, vegetarian on one level or another, right? And the strictness might vary, but this was a thing that was going on at this time. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting that you're tracing it through sort of kind of centuries or periods as opposed to lineages. And interestingly, around that time that you say there was a kind of a waning is also the time, for example, when the Gelugpas sort of took over Tibet with the help of the Mongolians and took sort of sole control of it under the sort of reign of the Dalai Lamas. Let's say it was a kind of a religious theocracy, not a democracy. And, there are scholars who are writing about this. For example, Nyangshim Gyal, who wrote a recent paper on how, in particular, the Gelug seemed to be, took a less strict view of eating animals compared to like other lineages, the other main lineages. And in fact, the current 14th Dalai Lama, as people know, has said that he does eat meat for health reasons, which some people have also said, he gets criticized for that because they believe that that's not, in accordance with the Buddhist teachings on the Vinaya, on meat eating and so on. But the thing is with this is it possible, because Ri-mey obviously was also a kind of a political movement. It was a sort of non-sectarian movement, but it was, teachers who were keen to get their texts and their lineages kind of back on the table and being taught again, because so many of their texts had been seized and sort of confiscated and sealed up and never to be published and so on. So, especially like the Jonang and the Kagyu. And so is there a possibility that also this kind of vegetarian resurgence, let's say around that time, as well as with the Ri-mey, is also a reaction to the Gelug hegemony and domination of Tibet at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to avoid that kind of a sense with some of this stuff. I mean, You mentioned the book, The Faults of Meat. One of the texts that's included in there is by Khedrub Je, this very foundational figure in the Gelug movement. And that text really is the sort of the strongest apologetic for eating meat, like the strongest sort of pro-meat eating text that I'm aware of. And I want to say pro-meat eating and put scare quotes around it, because even Khedrub Je in this text is not saying just eat whatever you want whenever you want, right? There are rules around it. You mentioned threefold purity a couple of times, and we'll have a chance in a minute to talk a little bit about that. But it's hard to avoid this sort of conclusion that probably, there's some influence here. And as the Gelug movement was spreading, Gelug monasteries were probably were very influenced by Khedrub Je's writings on this, and that may well have shaped their take on whether or not it was okay to eat meat within the monastery. At the same time, I don't think that that's going to be the only story, right? And I think that there are a lot of other things, sort of influences that come into play, maybe things that are less perhaps like overtly political. But also, we see this in movements all the time, right? Where people get very excited about something, and then maybe there's a little bit of like, oh wait, this is harder than we thought, kind of stepping back a little bit. And there are plenty of elements of, plenty of sort of pro-meat, if we want to put it that way, forces within Tibetan culture, independent of the sort of the Gelug system. So, it's like, it's a complex thing, and I don't want to sound like we're laying it all on Khedrub Je, right?
Sure. Yeah, well, no one would want to do that either. But, the thing is, as you mentioned, obviously, Tibet is much bigger than Tibetan Buddhism. Of course, it's not just Tibetan Buddhism. There are other cultural influences. And you even do mention even sort of the gender, sort of the masculinity that's associated with eating animals, let's say murdered animals in your work, which is also very interesting. Don't know if we'll have much time to go into that today, unfortunately. But the thing is, with if we sort of go now into the 20th and the 21st century, then, so what's clear is that, as you have shown, there was vegetarianism in Tibet very much prior to the 1959. And there is even a resurgence now going on with, for example, teachers like Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro Rinpoche. But I mean, I live in a Tibetan community in exile in India, and certainly my experience is that a huge amount of Tibetans eat meat still. And as you know, India is predominantly vegetarian still. Certainly here it is. And there are many question marks about this and many of those people are monastics. So, for example, I've seen monastics going and right up to the slaughterhouses and buying the freshly, slaughtered chicken. So there's obviously some kind of disconnect there between what the Buddha taught in terms of the Vinaya, the threefold purity rule, and how Tibetans in exile, let's say, if we leave Tibet to one side for now, are practicing that. So if we turn to the threefold purity rule, then, so as you know, this was a rule that the Buddha formulated when they were offered meat at a meal they attended, and he asked if it had been naturally, the animal was killed for them, and they said no, it naturally died. And so in those circumstances, he said it was permissible to eat it, but only in those sorts of circumstances, if it's been offered and it hasn't been deliberately killed for you. Now, some people are saying that, well, this is now being used to justify all sorts of kinds of meat eating by monastics who are not begging for alms, who are going into restaurants, who are going to the slaughterhouses and still, eating slaughtered animals out for pleasure or for health reasons. And many people would say that's not in accordance with these teachings that the Buddha gave. And certainly not in accordance with the sutra teachings, like from Lankavatara Sutra and Mahaparinibbana Sutra. So, what's your sort of thinking on that? And how much do you think the threefold purity rule has also influenced some of these Tibetan Buddhist masters in their writings?
I think threefold purity is, I think, sort of possibly the most important, piece of or sort of concept in how the Tibetan Buddhists have come to understand meeting, particularly within a monastic context, as you say. It's also probably the most controversial, right? Like there are longstanding disagreements amongst different Tibetan teachers on what exactly threefold purity means. The rule itself, the three in threefold purity, says you can eat meat. I mean, the rule says you can eat meat if you have not seen an animal killed specifically, the animal killed specifically for you, if you haven't heard that the animal was killed specifically for you, and you can't, as long as you don't suspect that the animal might have killed specifically for you. The real catch in it is that specifically for you part. And so it's like, when I talk about this, I often feel like, if you imagine a monastic going out in the morning to collect alms from someone in the village, and they show up at a house and they don't know that the homeowner, the layperson, doesn't know that this monastic is going to come. And the layperson has cooked themselves some breakfast that includes some meat. The monastic comes, opens up their bowl, the layperson puts some food in, monastic goes away and then eats the meat. From, all readings of threefold purity, that meat there would be acceptable because it was not the animal was not killed for the sake of the monastic, right? And the monastic, because the homeowner didn't know that they were going to show up, there's no question of, oh, well, maybe they killed it for me. Right, and so the monk can eat it. The monk or nun can eat it without worry. The debate in the Tibetan context often comes down to a question of, well, what about like meat purchased from a butcher? Because in that context, the animal technically was still not killed for a specific monastic, right? If you're a monastic and if you go to a butcher and you say, I'm going to come back tomorrow and I want you to kill a goat tonight and I'll come back tomorrow and buy it, pretty much everybody agrees that that would violate threefold purity. But if you walk in and the animals are already dead, they weren't killed with you specifically in mind, then there's a stream of interpretation in Tibetan commentaries on the Vinaya that says that that's actually just fine. But at that point, that meat is acceptable. And, that's kind of in many ways the logic that Khedrub Je picks up on. And
well, exactly. And I think
to do this,
yeah.
he's not the only one who.
No, he's not the only one, but I think it's also worth mentioning that obviously there are many other teachings by the Buddha on not eating animals that have been slaughtered, not just the threefold purity rule, that we need to take as a combination, not just threefold purity, but that to sort of see what the Buddha's intent was, right? And I think that the Vinaya rule was very much done when people were begging for alms and they weren't going into shops and they weren't going into slaughterhouses and going into restaurants and buying meat that had already been slaughtered. And I think, to sort of, it kind of subverts the Buddha's intent to sort of say that would somehow fit the threefold purity rule, because the Buddha wasn't actually talking about those situations, right? He was talking about when monastics were begging for alms and begging for food. And so this is what the 17th Karmapa was saying recently, was that, actually, if we look at it in the whole context of the Buddhist teachings, that's why he banned any sort of meat eating on the premises of Kagyu monasteries, is because he felt that it was completely inconsistent with the threefold purity for monastic. And he even said, if you're a monastic and you go out and eat meat in restaurants, you can't really call yourself a Karma Kagyu person, because you're going against all the teachings of the Karmapas and the Buddha on this. And many people were quite shocked by that, because a lot of the followers were doing exactly that, right, including monastics. So I think in a way, you know, he took quite a strong stand on it. And in a way, it challenged a lot of people to think about that threefold purity rule more, because I think, as I said, a lot of people also question the Gelugpas stance on it and the Khedrub Je stance on it, because in other sutras like the Lankavatara Sutra and Mahayana Sutra, you know, Buddha's clearly saying that actually, in most circumstances, you should not eat slaughtered animals at all, right? So, yeah, it just seems like it's a little bit kind of, you know, it's kind of sort of being clever, right? You're kind of cleverly saying, well, you know, I went to this restaurant, it was already it was already killed, so it doesn't count, so I can have it. And it's like, well, yeah, but then you're kind of discounting all the other sort of teachings given by the Buddha on this, right?
I guess the thing I would want, the point I would want to make on this is that it feels like, in some ways, it feels like sort of two streams of interpretation of threefold purity, right? One that says, you know, oh, you know, if you go to a butcher shop or you go to a restaurant, you know, the animal was not killed specifically for you, therefore it's okay. And then the other one, and you know, you mentioned the Karmapa, 17th Karmapa here. He's not by any measure the first to make that claim, right? There were, you know, have been a lot of Tibetan teachers over the years who were overtly critical of the sort of that interpretation of threefold purity. I mean, I think specifically of like Shabkar has this passage where he says, you know, look, some people say like, you know, that if you buy meat from a butcher shop, has threefold purity. But he's like, but look at this. The end result of that is we have butcher shops outside. So Shabkar's writing in the 18th century, right? He was like, early 19th century. We have butcher shops outside our monasteries, right? The only reason they're there is because the monks are going to go and buy the meat, right? So that doesn't count, right? And so this argument, it has been there for a long time, right? It's not a new sort of debate within the Tibetan context. And the other thing that you bring up here, the Lankavatara Sutra and the Mahaparinibbana Sutra, are also important parts of this. And Tibetans were well aware that these texts make explicit claims that the rule of threefold purity doesn't apply to Mahayana or sort of like later on forms of Buddhism. Sakya Pandita makes this in his text on the Three Vows, the Domsum. He makes this claim that he says, you know, for Shravakas, for those who follow only the vehicle of the listeners, right? The non-Mahayana Buddhists, he says, for them, threefold purity, you know, eating meat that has threefold purity is fine. But in the Mahayana, all meat is forbidden. And he's very much invoking this sort of idea in the Lankavatara Sutra and the Mahaparinibbana Sutra that threefold purity as a rule was a skillful means, right? These sutras claim that, you know, one of them, I forget which one off the top of my head, but, you know, the Buddha's asked, like, why did you allow it threefold purity in the first place? And he says, well, it was to make it easy for people to become Buddhist. And then once they became Buddhist, then we would say, okay, now no meat at all, right? And so these texts were well known, right? And were debated. And the thing, you know, the thing that makes vegetarianism to me seem so intriguing, like as an object of historical study, right, to look at, is precisely the fact that over 1,000 years, people continued to have this debate, and there wasn't a settled answer. There wasn't a settled, like, oh, everybody agrees that this is the right interpretation of these passages. It was very much an ongoing thing.
Yes, and so let's look at contemporary times now then, particularly in Tibet, because of course you mentioned in your book that there is a surge in vegetarianism in contemporary Tibet. Also in light of sort of Tibetan identity and resistance against the sort of central Chinese state you mentioned. So in your tricycle article, your recent tricycle article, you mentioned that, you know, some Western scholar had mentioned that vegetarianism in Tibet is a result of Chinese and Western Buddhists, for example, and you kind of pushed back on that a little bit and said, actually, no, it's also a kind of also even an identity, a resistance against the sort of dominant Chinese state there. So I wonder if you could perhaps talk a little bit about that as well, because some people may not be aware of that it's actually, taking off in Tibet as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing to say then is that, yeah, it's taking off in Tibet, right? I haven't been back. It's been since before COVID. So I don't have any firsthand awareness of what the context is now. But in, the sort of by the mid 2000s, and definitely by like 2010, there was a really strong vegetarian movement inside Tibet, right? You mentioned Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro, and he's clearly one of the major driving figures behind this. Certainly not the only one, though. There were people across Tibet. I think of figures like Jadrel Rinpoche, right, who was actively vegetarian in Tibet, and plenty of others of sort of differing stature and audience and so on and so forth. So this idea that like vegetarianism is something coming in from the outside, I'm sure that there's some influence there, right? And I remember the first time I was at Larangar, and I asked some monk about this, and he gives me a video, a VCD, and I was expecting it to be all like, some Tibetan Lama or something like that, and it turns out it's like Paul McCartney, right, on a PETA video.
Oh, interesting.
So it was there, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at things like the rhetoric that people like Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro use, if you look at the arguments that they make, these are the same arguments that draw on 1,000 years of Tibetan discussions of vegetarianism, right? They sometimes will pull in a little bit of a reference to something, like they might be like, oh, and also it's good for the environment. But the core arguments are the same ones that, pull all the way back across 1,000 years of history and religious debate in Tibet. Like, they're not new. This isn't something new coming in from, whether it's coming from China or coming from the West or something like that. This is something that's been part of and a struggle within Tibetan Buddhism for 1,000 years. And so
I think this is where your work in particular is very beneficial and useful, because it really brings out that this isn't some new thing. It has been there in Tibet for thousands of years, and not even necessarily in Tibetan Buddhism either. So I think that's very useful for people to know and understand, because there is a common kind of misperception almost that Tibetans aren't vegetarians, or they can't be vegetarians. And of course, in a place like that where there's little plant food, it is no doubt more difficult, right? So for example, in vegetarian India, it's very easy in many ways to be vegetarian, actually. But that's why it's even more astonishing in a way that there were these very well-known examples of Tibetan Buddhist masters who were very strict about it.
It's an interesting thing. I mean, one of the senses that I get from a lot of the older material, let's say the pre-1950 material, is that there's a sense that, being vegetarian was unhealthy. And it was unhealthy. It would potentially lead to illness, could even shorten your lifespan. But people were doing it anyway. Again, it was a minority. It wasn't everybody. It wasn't the majority. It was probably a small minority. But it was a consistent presence. And there was a sense that it was like a virtuous thing to do. It was a hardship for the Dharma. And so there is a sense in the older material that, this is a difficult thing that people are undertaking because they think it's the right thing to do. But also it's difficult enough that it was never expected, right? And so, or at least most of the time, it wouldn't have been expected. It's like, it was a virtuous thing if you could do it.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But also there was a lot of tolerance if you couldn't, and people weren't going to start telling you, oh, you're a bad person.
Yes. Well, obviously, in a situation where there isn't that much plant food, it's a different scenario. But I think the reason why some people are sort of quite critical these days, especially with all the other sort of issues to do with environmentalism and even health, actually. You know, people are saying that eating animals is actually bad for your health if you do it a lot. Is that why then is there this disconnect, let's say, within sort of certainly the Tibetan exile community, most of whom would say they are Buddhists if you ask them, going and eating daily slaughtered animals. And this is where I guess we could talk a little bit about addiction and carnism, which is not necessarily a Buddhist thing or idea, but it's certainly come out more in the sort of 21st century, let's say, about the addictive quality of meat. So obviously people get addicted to it from an early age, right? I mean, I grew up as a meat eater and it wasn't that easy to give up. But, you know, I think sometimes one has to sort of, it's the compassionate element, you know, when you see chickens all huddled up in cages, as you do here very regularly with nowhere to move and just waiting to die in the you know, the heat of the day, you know, it's very hard to sort of then go there and say, right, I would like to get some chicken. But people do. And they do that, it seems, without any sort of concern at all about where that's come from. So, yeah, what do you think about that? I mean, the disconnect there between, you know, the sort of labeling of oneself as a Tibetan Buddhist, a sort of cultural Buddhist, let's say, but practically not really following the Buddhist teachings on it.
I mean, so I'll say from my side, I don't want to be in a position to tell anybody what a Buddhist should or shouldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like that's my role. I think that I'll also say I'm not particularly comfortable with the language of addiction surrounding meat eating. I mean, it's a way to look at it. I do very much think that these are complex questions for a lot of people. And it's, you know, whether we're talking about Buddhists or Christians or whoever, there are a lot of sort of standards that people find difficult. And, you know, I would like us, you know, I feel like there's an element of like, that's real humanity, right? That's sort of like, just because I know that something is the right thing to do doesn't mean I'm going to do it. And there's multiple sort of pressures pulling me in different directions. One of the things I'll say that I have come to really appreciate about the Tibetan text that I'm reading about vegetarianism is that there's actually often a good deal of flexibility worked into them. And it's less about a defined identity. Like, it's less about you are vegetarian, which means you will never eat X, Y, or Z, and more about a combined sense of eating meat is bad. Also, we're human and avoiding meat is difficult. Mm-hmm. And so you get a lot of teachings where a teacher will be like, it's great if you can be totally vegetarian and never eat meat.
Yes.
But I also know that that's hard. And so if you can't do that, then try to avoid it on holy days.
Yes,
exactly.
Or
at least try to reduce, right? Or say prayers. And
yes,
all of these things, you know, all of these things actually I think are really important.
Yeah.
And I really like that it's often presented in a not strict kind of way.
Yes.
And there's a sense to me of people trying to do their best.
Sure.
Sometimes failing, right? And so, yeah, I guess you know, when I see that to me feels like, okay, this is a thing like that's happening in the world. And
yes, of course. I mean, no one can be expected to be like the 8th Karmapa or, you know, Jigten Sumgon. I mean, I think it was Jigten Sumgon who was dying or something, and someone offered him some broth with some meat broth or something.
Powdered yak lung in it. The doctor told him that if he would drink this soup made of powdered yak lung as medicine, he would get better. Right. He refused, and then he died.
Refused, yeah. So some people did, even in sort of those sorts of circumstances, have very strict sort of ideas about it. And I don't think we can necessarily say that's wrong either, right? I mean, obviously they really felt that was the Buddha's teachings, and that they you know, as the Buddha is taught in the Lankavatara Sutra, for example, that if you eat animals, you are more likely to be reborn an animal. So it's not just a compassion thing, right? Is it? The teachings are actually much wider than that as well. It's not, it's about killing, it's about compassion, but it's also about future lives, where you'll be reborn, your chakras, you know, how you smell to other people even, and you scare animals because, you know, and all of that. So that's all in there, right? So it's not just about compassion and killing, although some people say, going back to the threefold purity rule, that there are the 4 defeats in the monastic sangha, right? And one of the 4 defeats is killing or encouraging others to kill. And if you commit one of the 4 defeats, you're supposed to be automatically expelled from the monastic sangha, they say. Now, some people have argued that the encouraging others to kill of the 4 defeats, it's not the threefold purity, would cover butchers, right? So when you go into a butcher, you're encouraging others to kill because, you know, they won't, many places here in India, for example, they kill the animals just because they know people are coming to buy them, right? So it's kind of encouraging killing.
Yeah, I think the thing to my mind about all of this is, like, we say, like, what the Buddha taught.
Yeah.
But really what we're talking about is how the Buddha's teachings are interpreted. And it's not easy to say the Buddha taught X, because different groups of people have interpreted it in different ways. And you know, the idea of threefold purity was clearly there. It's in all the different recensions of the Vinaya that we've got. Most of my understanding is that when we're talking about the defeats, it's usually about killing a human. So there's definitely a distinction that's made there.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure about that. I thought it was, as far as I understood, it was all sentient beings, killing just generally. So that would cover all sentient beings, not just humans. But I'd have to double check that. But as far as I'm aware, 4 defeats covers killing of any sentient being, like by oneself, or encouraging others.
As I've understood the defeats specifically, I think the defeat is killing a human. Killing an animal is a lower order.
Okay, fault. I don't know that, but I would have to check it.
Obviously. I'm not sure either, so we can consult a Vinaya expert.
All right. Anyway, so moving on then away from the Buddhist teachings and into sort of, you know, as we were talking about the sort of resurgence in Tibet of this kind of vegetarianism, how much do you think that's also been influenced by, you know, even environmental sort of concerns? I mean, certainly non-Buddhists in the 21st century are very concerned about eating animals for environmental reasons, right? Nothing to do with the Buddhist teachings necessarily. What about in Tibet? Has that played a part at all, do you think?
I haven't seen a lot of it, is the truth. In some ways, it's actually perhaps, unfortunately, cutting the other direction, where the anti-slaughter movement is sometimes this movement to sort of, not for vegetarianism per se, but to avoid large-scale slaughtering, industrial slaughtering. There are also people saying, well, the problem is that now there are too many yaks and there's all kinds of environmental degradation across the grasslands, right? There's too many animals. They're eating the roots of the grass. The grass is dying. The grasslands are dying because we have too many yaks. There's certainly an awareness, I think, that I've gotten from a lot of my Tibetan friends in Tibet of the environmental benefits of vegetarianism. They're aware of it, but it's not the driving thing. When they talk about why they're vegetarian, they tend to invoke Buddhist ideas, right? And again, we look at Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro. His arguments are pretty much very traditional, right? They're coming from out of that traditional dialogue rather than sort of other stuff coming in.
So Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro Rinpoche was saying how pigeons, for example, if they have a meat diet, they tend to be much more aggressive and antisocial than pigeons without. So he is bringing in some 20th century research there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that he in particular has a great interest in science and scientific knowledge and all kinds of categories, not just with regards to meat eating. But I still think overall, right, the arguments that he makes about being vegetarian or the anti-slaughter movement and these things draw predominantly on traditional arguments that have have been part of this conversation, as we've said, for a long time, right?
Yes, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this subject, and obviously your work is extremely valuable and useful, not only for the scholarly community but for a wider community who are interested in Buddhism and vegetarianism, particularly in Tibet. So I think in that respect, thank you very much for the work that you've done and continue to do. Do you have any future plans for other sorts of research on this topic, or are you going into different areas?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. I'm in the process of co-editing a volume with a colleague, Bronwyn Finnegan, of Australian National University, on Buddhism and animal ethics. And so that's less historical, more philosophical take on some of these questions. And we have a really wonderful collection of chapters that have come in. It's still deep in the editing process, so it'll be, these things take time before it's out and available. But that will be hopefully not too long. And I'm really excited to get that.
Well, that sounds very interesting. Is that covering things like, for example, consciousness of animals, or sort of what Peter Singer was talking about how we treat animals, speciesism, for example?
Yeah, it's really trying to develop some sort of specific themes and areas in which Buddhist thought and Buddhist philosophy intersects with questions about animal ethics, right? And so it has some historical components, some kind of anthropological components, but a lot of it is ethical theory and philosophy. And again, it's an edited volume, so it's not by me, right? But it's really, we've got a great collection of chapters that I'm really excited to have out in the world soon.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. And if you could leave perhaps with saying, when you started doing this research on vegetarianism in Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism, was there any sort of particular sort of goal or purpose that you had in mind, or was it sort of more a personal interest? For example, do you have a sort of wish or desire to sort of yourself get across the sort of Buddhist vegetarian message, or is it more just a general scholarly academic research topic for you?
It's a little of both. I mean, it really is an academic topic for me. I will say again, as I said sort of earlier, I don't feel like it's my place to push too hard on anyone else to get them to adopt a particular practice or view or anything like that. That said, I do think of myself and my work as part of a broader sort of animal ethics movement. To my mind, I've often said I feel like the goal of that is not the adoption of a particular diet or approach, but thought and getting people to think about their relationship with animals in more specific ways, and to then make sort of conscious, reflective decisions about that. And so a lot of this stuff has been part of that, I guess, agenda, in the sense of I've wanted to, particularly with a volume like The Faults of Meat, and there's actually a Tibetan language volume that's sort of similar to that, except without any of the translations, is to kind of just put resources out there into the world and to get some of this stuff out to help people and to allow them to think through some of these
Mm.
some kind of difficult issues and come to their own decisions about what
Mm.
they want to do or not do. So
Yes.
to the extent that there's an activist in me, and
Mhm.
there's certainly, that's kind of the goal of it.
Okay, great. Well, that's very interesting. And just finally then, so out of all these sort of texts that you've researched, you've translated or compiled together, was there any particular text or a Tibetan Buddhist master whose writing on this subject really sort of touched your heart, really moved you yourself personally?
You know, that's a really interesting assessment, and or a really interesting question is
Mm.
what I mean to say. I think I'm gonna have to come back to Jigme Lingpa.
Mhm.
And even though he doesn't, to the best of my knowledge, write any long form um, analyses of vegetarianism. So, like for instance, he's not included in the Faults of Meat, the anthology that I did, because I didn't have any like substantial text from him. Rather, it's a lot of little bits here and there, and I'm not certain that he personally was vegetarian, right?
Mhm.
The
Yes.
thing the thing that I love about Jigme Lingpa, and you're asking sort of what touches me, is, prior to him, all of these discussions of vegetarianism were very much kind of legalistic, scholastic, focused on the Vinaya and these sort of analyses of what does the Vinaya allow or not allow, and this and that. And Jigme Lingpa really puts the emotion into it. And, there's this one passage where he's talking about the slaughter of a yak and
Mhm.
just sort of goes through this, like the experience from the perspective of the yak. And you're reading this, and it's clear that he's not trying to do some kind of complicated analysis of what's allowed and what's not allowed. And oh, there's this commentary. He's just trying to give you an emotional gut punch. And there's something that I really like about that, right? It sort of cuts to sort of like, yeah, okay, forget all this complex argumentation. We're just going to think about, like, put yourself in the place of that animal and think about this. And it's actually, so if we look at the people who came after him, including Shabkar and Patrul, you see a lot more of that, right? And I think that Jigme Lingpa is the point of transition from the sort of the legalistic approach to this sort of emotive, affective kind of literary approach.
Oh,
And
that's
so, yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
you're going to say any one person, I'm going to go with Jigme Lingpa.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. Are you aware of Milarepa's song on eating meat as well? And because that's also very emotive. I think one would say, right, that
Yeah.
talks about
Yeah,
the yeah.
I don't want to say that nobody prior to Jigme Lingpa had an
Okay.
affective like
Yeah.
response to meat. It's there. It's more like, and it's also not to say that Jigme Lingpa was unaware of the scholastic debates about like threefold
Yes, I
purity.
get you.
But I do think that there's like, at least I'll say from what I've read, and I'm perfectly
Yes.
willing to happy to have one else come along later and be like, actually, it's different. Um,
Okay.
but from what I've seen with these texts, there's a transition in
Yes.
tone from Jigme Lingpa. So yeah, we'll go with that. And if I'm going to pick a number two, I'm going to say
Yes.
Sharad Satoshi Gyaltsen. Is
Okay. And why is that?
I just like his writing. It's just beautiful writing, and it's clear, it's lucid, it gets to the point. Um, yeah,
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very
yeah.
much again for all the work that you've done on this. And as I say, it's very valuable and beneficial
Well, thank you.
for the scholarly community and the wider general public who are interested in this topic. So thank you very much again for joining me on Dakini Conversations. And I wish you all the best with the future book, right?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to others on Dakini Conversations.